say take one and pass it, because instead of visuals tonight, we're going to have handouts. How about that? So we got to have something visual. Got to have something visual.
Well, I got handouts on the floor.
Yeah, that's okay. I think I got plenty. And y'all don't have to be too Presbyterian in the back. Y'all can come up unless you want to give me a focal point. You know, give me a focal point in the back, and I'll just take my signal from them because we are going to go. Yeah, let me just check the door one last time here. Hey, there's actually 2 more cars out there. Wow. Yay. There's one.
Well,
Yeah, absolutely.
I hate to tell you, but I put on Facebook that there'd be refreshments.
Hey, how are you? Good. Lovely. All right.
There were 2 more cars coming in behind me.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. We got several here. Yeah. And remind me for the future, I'm trying to steer clear of your Rotary stuff because you obviously bring somebody with you. So
Second and fourth Tuesday.
second and fourth Tuesdays. We're gonna shoot.
I'll email you.
We're gonna shoot for Thursdays. Here. Hey, Louisa, how are you? Here's your. Oh, you got one for? Okay, very good.
Bill, is your dot Carolina?
That would be would be little PD.
Okay.
I don't have any record.
Well, that's what I was thinking.
That'd be down Pine Tree Hill. Those aren't good. And that's not all of them, but I tried on the map with a few. Yeah. Do you have any record of Carolina?
No, I didn't.
And the Gaelic.
I never heard anybody speaking anything but 3 pages.
Yeah. All right. I'll make just one. All right. Looks like we're pretty close to 7 up. So I'm gonna let my producers over here. First off, thanks everybody. Before we get started, just let you know, I hope I can sneeze. That'd be embarrassing. I have to do that. I got it out. Let's see, Minor, here's a handout for you. All right. We are going to be going live in just a moment, and so we'll sort of be aware of that. And yeah. We are live. Okay, very good. Well, we are live, and welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. And it's a busy time of the year, but we wanted to try to get back on track with this series of presentations that we've done over the past year, and this will be including one obviously for 2024. Just to give you a little highlight of some of the things we have coming up in the coming year. In January, we always celebrate Robert Burns Day, those of us that know things about Scots. But, Burns has been done a whole lot. And many of you here have probably heard enough Burns poems and may be able to recite a few of the lines of the Ode to the Haggis and things like that. But we've never done anything on the Robert Burns of the South. Our own John Charles McNeill, the first poet laureate of North Carolina, who descended from obviously Argyll people, native of Scotland County. And he was indeed deemed the Robert Burns of the South by the Charlotte Observer at one point. It was either the Charlotte Observer or the Atlanta Constitution one. So Dr. Mary Wayne Watson is going to be with us on Thursday night, the 23rd of January. Going to be doing a little bit of biographical information on McNeill, talking a bit about his importance, and have some readings because those of you that aren't familiar with John Charles McNeill, he wrote in a Southern dialect, he wrote in the Lumbee dialect, he wrote in African American dialect, and he also wrote in Broad Scots, just like Burns. So we're going to have some readings of John Charles McNeill's works here in January. So we'll be sending out some reminders about that, as well as sharing it on the social media. So thank you once again for coming out tonight. Particularly like to thank Rooney Kaufman and his young helper here tonight for helping us go live. And I know there's a lot of people, I've had inquiries from as far away as Texas and Scotland about tonight's presentation. So I hope that some of those folks are tuning in or will be able to see what we're doing tonight at a later time, because it will be posted up on the university's Facebook page. So here we are. The Carolina Gaels, the title of tonight's presentation. And we should probably start out with a bit of an introduction to Gaelic. What is Gaelic? Well, Gaelic is part of a family of Celtic languages, and that those families of Celtic languages consist of two groups. One is the Brythonic languages of the Britons, which is Welsh and Cornish and Breton in France, which is the largest of all of the currently spoken Celtic languages, Breton in France. And then the Gaelic language group, which includes Irish Gaelic, Scots Gaelic, and Manx Gaelic, the Gaelic of the Isle of Man. Irish and Scots Gaelic were originally pretty much uniform, but Scots Gaelic deviated a bit through the centuries to a very similar yet unique language, and thus Scots and Irish aren't exactly the same. What does Gaelic have to do with us here in the United States, and particularly us here in the Carolinas? Well, we've got to go back to 1739 with the arrival of the first organized party of Highland Scots that came here. The Argyll colony came in the fall of 1739, and there was a period of immigration that lasted for roughly 100 years that brought Scots from the Highlands of Scotland that were Gaelic speakers here to these parts of the Carolinas. And they continued the use of that language in many cases well beyond the immigrant generation. Now, I'd like to call your attention to the handout that I gave out to you. If you look at the first page there, the map, you're going to see basically a division of Scotland there, which is both geographical, topographical, if you will, geological to a degree, but also cultural as well, because that's defining the Highland line. The area that you see shaded to the north and to the west there, that's the Highlands as we know them, but not just to the north. As you see, we're going all the way down south here to the islands of Arran, down to the Kintyre Peninsula, right at Ireland there. So those places defined not only because of their geography and topography, but also because of the cultural and linguistic difference. These were the Gaelic speaking areas, and these are where our people came from here in the Carolinas. So that one is a note to you to sort of give you a geographical perspective to think about, and some of the places that will be mentioned in this presentation. So prominence, why is Gaelic important? Why was it prominent? Well, here's something that we can look at. Gaelic was no doubt the most commonly spoken European or minority language in North Carolina until the latter part of the 20th century. Now think about that. What languages would we have heard in colonial North Carolina? We obviously would have had English. We would have had dialects of English, Ulster English that would have come in through Ulster Scots that came down the Great Wagon Road into Piedmont. We had German settlers that came into the New Bern area, as well as up into the Old Salem, Bethabara, and into that Moravian colony of folks from Czechoslovakia and southeastern Germany there. So we know that there were different languages spoken. French Huguenot, We know that we had Spanish people that explored, leaving behind a linguistic trace necessarily, but a language that was historically spoken. But Gaelic, there were certainly very many more Highland Scots than there ever were Germans in the Upper Piedmont. And when we look at other language possibilities, the only thing that would have perhaps eclipsed that would be the native languages, Cherokee, for example, here in North Carolina. So that's a very important point to note. Another point to note that sort of speaks to the use of Gaelic is the fact that when we think about all of these other ethnic groups that populated the Carolinas, everybody else came from somewhere first before they came here. You know, we got people that came into Tidewater, Virginia, that came into northeastern North Carolina, even as far down south here by the 1750s. We got the Ulster people coming in the Wagon Road, things like that. The Germans that are coming in Pennsylvania, coming down the Ulster Scots through Pennsylvania once again. Maybe some French Huguenots that are coming in through South Carolina and all as well. The only group that came to North Carolina directly from the mother country in any numbers were Highland Scots. And in most cases, Gaelic-speaking Highland Scots. Now, to venture a little bit further with that, I would wager to bet that Gaelic was probably among the top 5 languages, or very close to it, if not, historically spoken in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi as well. Again, that's just something I came up with today and thought about it, but when you think about all the ethnic groups making up those areas, because we had a lot of our Gaels that out-migrated south and west, we'll talk about the record of those and the fact that there were even Gaelic-speaking churches in Alabama and Mississippi in the 1830s and 40s that had their roots here in North Carolina. So we'll get to that. So our first immigrant Gaels came here from Argyll, particularly from the Kintyre Peninsula, this part down here from the islands of Isla and Jura and Colonsay. That was our 1739ers, the first organized party, 350 people that came in the fall of 1739. And it's important to note that they were not really reinforced as a group until some years later. We're going to talk about that just a moment in a little bit more detail, but nonetheless. So you've got that group of people coming in, not reinforced until years later. Think about that year, 1739. That's 6 years before Culloden, and 6 years before a lot of the motivations which led people, due to the decline of the clan system, due to agricultural changes, due to economic changes, a lot of things which led people out in later years. That's before these people came out. So we know among that first group of 350, there were certainly Gaelic speakers or folks that were certainly bilingual among them. All right. In later years, we certainly had people that came out from not only that area of Argyll, but coming from the islands of Mull, coming from Skye, coming from the West Highlands, Glenelg, Sutherland, up to the north. Even people from Caithness in the very north, even though Caithness isn't necessarily looked on as being quite as Gaelic, if you will, as say the Western Highlands up in Sutherland and Skye and places like that. We did not have large numbers of people coming out from the outer islands, from Lewis, from the Uists, Barra. You know, all the McNeils think they came from Barra. No. Our McNeils came from Colonsay and the Kintyre Peninsula and those regions there. So, but anyway, all coming from Gaelic-speaking areas. Now, they were reinforced through the years by thousands of others who came from those same areas on through until roughly the 1830s and 1840s in sizable groups. And even a last effort to recruit and settle Highland people among this old Highland settlement in the 1880s, which included, again, folks that were Gaelic speakers. So that tradition went on for 150 years plus after immigration of people that are coming in. But they also were reinforced by families and people that kept the language going during that time and even later. So how do we tell the story of Gaelic in North Carolina? Well, one of the easiest ways for us to do that is to talk about the history of the Presbyterian Church in this part of North Carolina. in eastern North Carolina, southeastern North Carolina particularly. The first group of 1739 Argyle colonists had made tremendous efforts to bring along a minister with them, but they were unsuccessful. A few years later, the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge tried to send missionaries to this area, as well as to other places where there were Scots settled to Georgia, into upstate New York and other places there. They were unsuccessful. And it wasn't until 18 years after they had come that they were serviced by a minister who could speak in their language. The earliest churches in our presbytery, the old Fayetteville Presbytery, are Bluff, Barbecue, and Longstreet. Those are going to be names that are going to be familiar to everybody here. All right. And we know that people were meeting around those communities where those meeting houses were prior to the coming of the first minister, because in 1756, there's a man called Hugh McAdden. He's a Presbyterian and Ulster man from Pennsylvania that comes down to sort of examine and find out the status of the settlement. And he had a diary, and there are excerpts from that diary that were reproduced in a pretty important work on the history of Presbyterianism in North Carolina called Sketches of North Carolina by the Reverend William Henry Foote. Now, unfortunately, McAdden's diary does not survive. It would have been a tremendous resource to tell us about all the things and people that he found and all. But the things that were quoted in Foote from him say a few things that give us a lot of hints about Gaelic. He says, first, when he visited among one of these, I think the first place that he visited was the Bluff area, what was called Roger's Meeting House for a man named Roger McNeil. That's near present-day Bluff, present-day Wade, North Carolina, and that part of Cumberland County. He mentioned that the people gathered there, that their Christianity seemed to be feigned, that they were more concerned with the social aspects of gathering together as well as drinking whiskey afterwards. Typical Sunday afternoon, right? All right. He also noted that he doubted among these visits that people could understand a word he said. Obviously, English speaker, they're showing up out of respect to show what's going on. Gaelic speaker can't understand an English speaker necessarily. All right. You've also got the thing that he says, which I think is quite telling. He said they're the poorest singers he ever heard in all his life. Now, that's an interesting thing to note, because this is at the time when hymnody would have been lined out. If you know what I'm saying, lined out hymnody. You got your precentor that chants out the line of the hymn in metrical psalms, and then the congregation responds. Well, that was a common practice going on. But if you've ever heard Gaelic psalm singing, just go home and Google Gaelic psalm singing Isle of Lewis and listen to this. It doesn't have meter to a great degree. It's just this rising and falling melody that's just, one can imagine that someone, thought they're very poor singers. So that's our first story. But McAdden goes back to Pennsylvania and he finds out these people need a minister. And he's able to secure the help of a man named James Campbell, who's a native of Campbellton in Argyle. He's born 1705, dies in 1780. Campbell calls down and serves these three nations. He's the first minister of the old Fayetteville Presbytery, the first speaker of Gaelic that these people have heard officially from the pulpit many, many years before. Starts our Gaelic tradition there. What else can tell the story of Gaels in North Carolina? We don't have a lot of things in their own words. You know how many printed or written documents we have from Gaelic in North Carolina? You think large numbers of people, you can count them all on one hand. Just as a hint as to how closely tied to old Celtic religion things were, the only written document, handwritten document that we have that survives in Gaelic was an old Gaelic charm, supposedly dating from about 1750. It's in the state archives in Raleigh. And this charm is supposed to protect the person holding it from all sorts of bad things, from people with the evil eye. It's supposed to protect them and their cattle and their livestock from disease. It's supposed to take them away from evil and evil spells and things. It's a charm. It's written out just a very small piece of paper. But again, liking back to this early Christian combination of Celtic spirituality and Christian spirituality there. So that's the first thing, and probably the most important thing that we have out of that. The others are quite few, but one of them is the story of the experience written in poetry and song by a man called Ian McVerticky. And the Gaelic speakers I'll apologize for my pronunciations on that, but Ian McVerticky, who was a great bard who came here to North Carolina and wrote songs about his experience here. We'll talk about him in just a moment. One of the other ways that we can tell the story of Gaelic here in North Carolina is through travelers' accounts, people that visited the region and made note of the fact that there were Gaelic speakers here and how extraordinary it was. All right. We also can tell the story through the place names as well as the given names and surnames that we find here. But most importantly, some of the surnames, which are pure Gaelic, which still survive. And also these reminiscences that some might have of the last people that knew anything of the language. Now, we go back to our early Argyll colony. Gaelic speakers among them, they sought a minister that could preach. James Campbell comes, and he comes here in 1757-58, sort of solidifies and organizes the three earliest Presbyterian churches that we have here. But he's the only man serving a pretty large geographical area. He's not joined until about 13 years later by John MacLeod. John MacLeod is an ordained minister from the island of Skye. One of the important notes about him is that the communion cups at Old Bluff Church are exact replicas of those used by the MacLeod gentry at Dunvegan. He obviously was affiliated with them, and what you see is the same thing that MacLeod Chief Roy Moore drank his communion out of there at Bluff Church, and then were presented to him, the minister of that church. He's from Skye. He ends up being pro-loyalist at this time, coming out on the eve of the American Revolution. We don't know his full story, except the fact that he was pro-loyalist. He supposedly evacuates or leaves the community due to pressures. He's lost at sea someplace on the way back to Scotland. So only a little bit of a story there of him. We've got another story, though, of a man called John Bethune. John Bethune came from Skye in the year 1774. Could have possibly come on the same ship that Flora and Allen MacDonald of Kingsborough came on. He would have certainly been known by them as a minister in Loch Alsh in the parish of Slate in the island of Skye. He's the man that founded a little congregation called Mount Carmel up in northern Richmond, right on the Richmond-Montgomery County line. He was the chaplain to the loyalist forces that marched off to their defeat at Moores Creek. So needless to say, he didn't stick around for a great deal of legacy himself. But the important thing is he left and he was captured at Moores Creek. He was eventually exchanged parole, made his way to Canada, where he becomes the father of Presbyterianism in Eastern Canada. He founded the first Presbyterian church in Montreal, as well as a group of Presbyterian churches in Glengarry County, Ontario, right on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And a special note is the fact that his fourth great-great-grandson was Christopher Plummer, Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music. So a little footnote there to him. So loyalist leanings obviously affected the ministry at the time of the American Revolution, which gives us a good segue into the Revolutionary War period here. Most of you here, many of you listening, would know of the Moores Creek Bridge campaign and the effort to make a rising among the Highland loyalists in the Upper Cape Fear region at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. If historians are correct, and we really have no way of really knowing true numbers, but a lot of historians would say that by the coming of the American Revolution, there's someplace between 15 and 30,000 Highland Scots living in this region by the coming of the American Revolution. 30,000 probably on the high side, 15 probably on the low side, somewhere in the middle maybe. All right. The number of troops that was raised for the Morris Creek campaign, which also included regulators from the Piedmont area, but primarily Highlanders from this area, only between 15 and 1,600. So if one looks at those numbers and you think about the fact that if all your able-bodied males are so ardently loyalist, that group should have been much, much larger than it was. And the fact is that there's certainly a whole lot of people that rode the fence. There were even people deserting as the force left, marching down the Cape Fear River on their way to the defeat at Morris Creek. But in any event, so that's one factor to keep in mind. But another idea that once we use the numbers to think about the number of Gaelic speakers that might have been in this region at that time. That was important enough to have been noted by the Colonial Assembly here in North Carolina. They certainly knew that this potentially hostile group of Scots was here, so they tried to get some emissaries to move among them and at least let them hear another side of the story outside of what they're hearing from their community leaders, which were folks like Allan MacDonald Kingsborough, who were loyalists. They made efforts to send Alexander McAllister, one of the 39ers, who was quite an old man at that time. They also made some efforts to contact a revolutionary officer named McIntosh to come and visit among them. Now, there's a very famous McIntosh, Alexander McIntosh from Georgia, who descended from Oglethorpe's Highland settlement there, an ardent patriot. Whether it was him or whether, I think, an even closer man, there were families of McIntoshes who lived as part of the Society Hill community there just across the PD River. There were McIntoshes there that were Scots. I almost wonder if it could have been them as opposed to McIntosh all the way from Georgia. But nonetheless, made some efforts. We don't know that anything came to fruition out of that. And it obviously didn't have a whole lot of impact because people did what they did. But again, most people riding the fence. How do we know about the Revolutionary War period for these people? We know that a lot of these people marched off to Morris Creek and to their defeat. Many were captured, others were paroled, went back home until Cornwallis came again, or simply stayed at home and stayed apolitical during that time. But the only account that we have of a Scots immigrant in his own language, Gaelic, is through the poetry of a man called Ian McVertice. John McCrae, as he's commented on here in North Carolina, but actually his name was John Murkison. Recent research has proven that. A great book I would recommend by a woman named Maya Sheena Campbell called Ian McVertice, The Life and Work of John McCrae, Kentucky, North Carolina. Excellent. It's got all of his known works in it. Talks all about the experience in North Carolina. But I want to give you a couple examples. And put yourself in the mindset here of a Gaelic speaker. I'm not going to give it in Gaelic. I can't do all of that. But this is a song he wrote. It says, "Be done with sleep, my darling beloved. Rise early in the morning. Great will be your renown. And you'll get a landowner and a prosperous youth. And better than that, to sleep in hovels. Sleep has been my ruin. I'm heavy-hearted and it envelops me. Although I'd get a landowner who would kill the deer, I'd prefer sleep to all that I've ever seen. Be done with sleep while you're a young child. Let me see your tartan, your plaid, and your tweed at festival and market, making mirth and music. Better that for you than to sleep in a cave." And he goes on. We're now in America, at the frontiers of the never-ending forest. When winter comes and warmth returns, nuts and apples and sugar will grow. All right. Here's an idea for a young newborn child. Things are going to be better for you. Things are going to be better for you. We're in a new land. You've got opportunities. You're going to get a good landowner, and you're going to go on quite an interesting sleep softly, my darling beloved. Sleep softly, my darling beloved. Stay as you are now that you're in a new land. We'll find suitors abounding in wealth and fame. And if you're worthy, you'll have one of them. We are now in America, in the shade of the never-ending forest. When winter departs and warmth returns, nuts, apples, and sugar will grow. Little do I like the people that are here with their drugget coats and tall hats on their heads, and their short breeches split to the ends. Hose are never seen, and that's a pity. We've become Indians surely enough, skulking under trees. Not one of us will be left alive with wolves and beasts howling in every lair. We've come to ruin since the day we forsook King George. All right. And his final work, I'm going to read just a couple of excerpts here. Imagine this. You're a Tory, you're a Gaelic-speaking Tory. Everything's gone against you. You've just arrived here in the U.S. War is outbroken. Your plantation's been pillaged, and you've been captured, and you've escaped. And I've been a fugitive since autumn, building huts with no smoke rising from them. I'm weary of this exile. I'm weary of strife. This is truly the land of misery. In a small brushwood hut where no friends come to inquire about me, although I'm a fugitive, no charge can be laid on me except loyal service to my king, to which he's entitled. Bear my sincere greeting to the land where I ought to be. Bear my greeting to Kintail, where there's music. And he goes on to finish with the last lines, very poignant. I'm now condemned to an uninhabitable prison. If Cornwallis would come, I'd go with him gladly to wreak destruction on the wretches who took my clothing and my property. That's the only thing that we have in their own language about the experience of a Gaelic speaker, particularly a loyalist Gaelic speaker. There's several more poems that he wrote about his experience here. In synopsis, he was a friend of John Bethune, the minister I spoke about earlier. In fact, they exchanged letters. Bethune encouraged him. He wrote a poem about Bethune and the letter he got from him, which encouraged him about all the great things he'd found. But he found himself on the wrong side in Moores Creek. He's captured at Moores Creek. He's exchanged. He makes his way back north. He's on his way down south to the 1778 campaign on Savannah. He's captured again. And he's exchanged and he's posted to Cheraw by Lord Cornwallis, where he's supposed to be an emissary into the Scots of this region. Down in Cheraw, the 71st Highland Regiment was based there, right on the edge of this Highland settlement. And so he was supposed to go out and perhaps recruit and help Cornwallis gain a good partisan party there. But he wasn't able to. He fell sick. He was taken to Camden, and he died in Camden. Although there's a lot of local legends that say that he was betrayed. Somebody said that he was drawn by horses and he was betrayed by some of his patriot neighbors and things like that. Now, we know what happened to the guy now, thanks to the research in this book right here. But it's a very interesting story. And again, the only thing in the language, but that speaks to the experience in the American Revolution. Post-Revolutionary War. We've obviously got a lot of Tories, loyalists, many of them being Scots who were displaced for one reason or the other. Some being removed as early as 1777, fleeing north to the loyalist havens of Philadelphia and New York and making their way up to the Canadian Maritimes and Eastern Ontario. We've also got people later, as we find out at the time of the evacuation of Charleston. There's a large number of people from what's present-day Hoke and Robeson County, a whole company of about 140 men that were evacuated with the British forces from Charleston on Christmas Day, 1782. But we find a man there after the war. We don't know how he ended up there, but it's a man called Dougal Crawford. And Dougal Crawford was from the island of Arran, down here. He was a minister, and he had been engaged in the Dutch service at some point around the time of the Revolutionary War. How he got to Charleston, we don't know. But he was somehow discovered there, and there were people from the Raft Swamp congregation, that'd be present-day Antioch, Red Springs area, that found out about him, went to visit him at Charleston while he was still there, before the British evacuated, convinced him that they needed a minister to come back and preach to them. So these men went, they found him, they engaged his services. They first had to sail from Charleston to Georgetown. From Georgetown, they made their way on a barge all the way up the Lumber River to Campbell's Bridge, right outside the Campbell Soup Plant on Highway 71 down here, which is the head of navigation on the Lumber River at that point, or Drowning Creek, whichever you want to call it, and drug all of his possessions all the way back to where he made his home. And he was a minister in this area for quite a long time. The interesting thing about him is he was obviously quite popular. And he made a couple of trips back to Scotland before he left this area around 1791. But before he did, he had 2 farewell sermons which were printed in Gaelic in Fayetteville. Copies right here. There's only one known copy that survived of that. It was given to the First Presbyterian Church in Fayetteville many, many years ago. Several years ago, when I was staging the exhibits for the center here, I was able to find the church historian there who allowed me, I just wanted the front page that showed this is being printed in Fayetteville, 1791. She graciously allowed me at that point, and this is years ago, to make good scans of the whole thing. Thank goodness, because the document has gone missing. But I don't know what happened to it. The important thing is it's the first document that was ever printed in Gaelic in all of North America. Only one known copy. UNC Library at Chapel Hill called me up a few years ago. Do you know anything about this? I said, yes, I had my hands on it. I saw it. Gave it back to the woman who was custodian of it, who's now passed away. But I've got a scan of it. And now my scan is at UNC Library, at Wilson Library at Chapel Hill. It's been the subject of a lot of research, but important in being a printed document. So what does that tell us about Gaels? If there's a demand for a printed document that can read, there's enough of a demand for printed material, even in limited number. First thing printed in Gaelic in North America. So that one's important. Dougal Crawford eventually made his way back to Scotland, continued his career preaching in the island of Arran, never came back to North America. They said he was lost at sea. That was the legend, that he was lost at sea. But in actuality, he was boarding a small ferry boat off a larger boat in Arran, and he fell off the ship, being roped over or something, and busted his head and died. He was lost at sea, but not in the same way, that the romantic way. The idea was he'd fallen in love with a woman out of the barbecue congregation. It was unrequited, and so he left and sailed away and was lost at sea. Great romantic story, but not true at all. But nonetheless, he was the first to follow up these loyalists who had to leave, and immigration continues. It picks up once again at the end of the Revolutionary War era. 1790s in particular, we have large numbers, Lismore and Appin in Argyll, other parts in the Kintyre Peninsula. In those years, we also had, particularly years 1802 and through 1804, large numbers of people coming out from the Isle of Skye as well. All these people that are going to be Gaelic speakers coming out. So we're starting to get reinforcement. So again, another need for Gaelic. So what's the status of Gaelic in the 19th century, and how can we tell? Well, because churches are still using and needing Gaelic ministers. There's a proliferation of new churches and the arrival of other Gaelic-speaking ministers. Colin Lindsay. Many are going to know of Colin Lindsay, the legendary character buried out here at Stewartsville Cemetery. They say the man that was born after his mother died. The legend was that supposedly his mother was ill, went comatose. They thought she was dead. They buried her. Grave robbers came about to cut some valuable rings off her fingers. They exhumed the body, cut them off, and she bled, and she came back to life. And, common folk motif, but a very well-known, up until recent times, story about this area. So our man there, Colin Lindsay, Gaelic speaker, he founded a congregation, actually our furthest east. If you turn to the next page in your handout, you'll see down here in Sampson County, the Black River Church down there, which was founded primarily of Arran people. He ministered there before he came up here to Scotland and surrounding counties, and ministered all the way from Fayetteville down to us here in Scotland County. And this map shows the locations of at least some of the Gaelic-speaking church congregation in the 19th century. So that's going to give you an idea of the geographical dispersity of the language at that point as well, and giving us an idea of where these Highland folk, where these Gaelic speakers are settled. All right. But in any event, so we've got another man that arrives, another minister, Angus MacDermid from Islay. We've got Colin Lindsay here. The two of those guys were very old school ministers. They like to visit around to their congregations, and in the old Highland way, what do when you visit somebody? You offer them the cup of kindness. And one can imagine after a long day visiting all your congregants that you might be a little tipsy. And so he and Angus MacDermid were thrown out of the church, in and out of the church, numerous times in the old presbytery, but they were beloved in this area. And they're the guys that became the real founding fathers of the churches in this southern part of this community, a center. They preached at Red Bluff, which became Smyrna. They preached at Old Laurel Hill. They were very beloved men, even though they weren't officially part of the presbytery at that point. All right. Colin McEver, coming from Lewis, island of Lewis. He comes to the U.S. about 1809, educated at Hampton, Sydney. His first charge is teaching at the old Fayetteville Academy, the Donaldson Academy, the earliest forerunner of St. Andrews. He teaches there, then he takes the ministry, he's sent down to South Carolina, then back up to Kershaw County and Chesterfield County, where he preaches in Gaelic. Some congregations have out-migrated people from this area here by the 18 teens. Pine Tree Church there in that area. We also have the ordination of people locally, American-born Gaelic speakers. Malcolm McNair, who's buried right here in Scotland County, was one of them, served a lot of these local churches, preaching in Gaelic and English. There were 5 men that were ordained within this old presbytery in 1801, and we know at least 3 of them were Gaelic speakers. So there's even an account around 1808 of a revival. This again, it's time of the revival movement here in the U.S. You know, and there's an account of a revival, a tent revival up in Moore County, where there's a man preaching in Gaelic as well as the people preaching in English as well. All right, so our man McEver, who comes here, he's in here by the 18 teens, following the War of 1812. He wrote in 1850 to the Stornoway Gazette in Lewis, his home newspaper of years back, that he served communion and preached in Gaelic to folks that had come from as far as 40 miles away to hear it for the first time in many years. Now, when he was preaching, he thanked at Galatia right now. Those of you that are going to know this area up 401, right as you go into Cumberland County there, Galatia is there on the right there. 40 miles. Think about a 40-mile circle from Galatia, just between Rayford and Fayetteville. That includes us. That includes as far north as Sanford. That includes as far west as Montgomery and maybe eastern Anson County. If there are people that came from that far, that's sort of giving us another idea of where there's still Gaelic speakers here by 1850 on the eve of the Civil War. And then again, the eve of the Civil War, we got 2 more men that come in part because of the need of Gaelic-speaking ministers. James Sinclair, who was the topic of a very exciting program a few months back, and his father, John Campbell Sinclair, who ministered at Barbecue, and James preaching here at Ashpole and Smyrna and Lumberton. Both were Gaelic speakers and sort of came to this area in part because of the need for Gaelic speakers to minister here as late as the eve of the Civil War. And it's interesting to note that as late as 1872, that James Sinclair, who's living in Lumberton, North Carolina, is a subscription agent for the Gaelic newspaper and Gale. So you got somebody that is a subscription agent that can help people get a Gaelic newspaper published in Canada here in this area. There's obviously some demand for it. Some people that can read it. Some people that want it. Again, that's another hint as to the status here. We talked a lot about Presbyterians. Let's talk about Baptist and Methodist for just a moment. Many of you may know the story of Daniel White and the beginnings of the Riverton community here in Scotland County. Daniel White came from a place called Rue in Dumbartonshire, on the south side of Loch Lomond, the north side of the Firth of Clyde, on the edge of the Gaeltacht there. But he supposedly grew up as a young man, was enamored by the Barton preachers. These are self-ordained ministers that were preaching to the common folk in barns, and he became inspired by them. And he supposedly had a dream of preaching in America. And that's what led him to come here, a second sight vision. All right. He comes here about 1806 with his wife, Catherine Campbell. He founds the Baptist congregations at Lumber Bridge, at Spring Hill and Wagram, and at Mount Moriah down outside of Maxton, all three of which started as bilingual congregations, Baptists. Now, I've often asked this question: were they Baptists before they came, or were they Baptists out of convenience after they arrived? Interesting question, but I have been told by the scholar of the Baptist faith in Scotland that certainly there was a Baptist revival movement in the parts of Argyll where some of our people came from at that time. And it may have been out of convenience for language. It may have been because they were enamored by this more dynamic form of worship, let's say, there. So we have him. He's followed up by his protege, John Monroe, an American-born, came here to North Carolina. Supposedly, he was born around 1790, came here as a young boy. Excuse me, I'm talking about the next man here. John Monroe came here. His parents were Scots. He's American-born. He's the last of the Baptists, but one of the latter Gaelic-speaking ministers, because he didn't die until 1889. He ministers to these churches that White's founded. And in 1884, when there's a group of Highland crofters that are recruited to this area, they bill him as the local minister who can visit around and preach to them. He's actually, on the arrival of these people in Laurinburg in March of that year, he's supposed to do oration and prayer for them in Gaelic. We know that he could speak it. We know that he could speak it. I've actually seen a letter in which he wrote the titles of some Gaelic songs down. So he was one of the last, a Baptist, preaching in Gaelic until he's at least 80 years old. And then how about the Methodist? Alan McCorkadale. Anybody here familiar with Caledonia Methodist Church right over the way here? Yeah, all right, Caledonia. His first minister was a man called Alan McCorkadale. That name is peculiar. We don't know that one very commonly around here. It's a name that's known from the island of Lismore, predominantly, as well as other places in Argyll. Perhaps he may have come with a group of people from Lismore that came around 1803, including the folks that founded the Little PD Presbyterian Church down outside of Dillon. But nonetheless, comes to America as a young boy, and again sort of becomes a stray away from the Presbyterians and becomes enamored with the Methodist forms of religion, and becomes a circuit rider. And he rides all the way from this area all the way down to Darlington and Lee counties in South Carolina. He's buried in Bishopville, South Carolina, but he was the founding minister at Caledonia Methodist here. So here in Scotland County, our earliest Presbyterian, Baptist, and Methodist churches all started out as bilingual congregations. And in the case of this man, McCorkadale, I just recently found a very interesting story about him. In his obituary, he said evidently he had succumbed to some form of dementia or something like that, because they said in the very end, in his last days, all he was doing was preaching and praying in Gaelic in a loud voice out of his bed. So, interesting story there. Now, another way for us to tell about the Gaels: travelers' accounts and anecdotes. And these are quite, they're quite prolific. And I'd like to give you a few little excerpts of some of them that I think will be very enlightening. One of the first ones that appears in Scotland is from a one called Amy Grant of Laggan, who published in 1813 a collection of essays about Highland folk ways and customs. And she says that in the 1790s that the Highland settlement in North Carolina has grown wealthy, and they've been able to purchase slaves, and they've taught them their own language. I've seen myself Negroes in such families who could not speak a word of English. So that's an interesting footnote. We're going to come back to that in a moment. All right. How about the other people that are visiting? The first American ambassador from Great Britain, Lady Liston, the wife of that first ambassador, Basil Hall, visited. They did a coach tour of the South, and she noted that throughout the time that they traveled from the Virginia line until they went into South Carolina, they came across numbers of places and where there were Scots, and certainly a lot of them speaking Gaelic. She says the Gaelic language is still prevalent amongst them. Their Negroes speak it, and they have a clergyman who preaches in it. Now, keep that second note in mind. We're going to come to that. It's very interesting in a moment. Other bits of evidence. Again, we've got this printed sermon, but it's been found in a Fayetteville newspaper, an advertisement for a bookseller who says that you can purchase books in his store as well as those written in German and in Gaelic. Now, Fayetteville. Why German and why Gaelic? Think about where Fayetteville is. Think about that road that goes from the west side of Fayetteville across Fort Bragg up into the Piedmont. It's called the Yadkin Road. That was the predominant trade route between those German settlements in the upper Piedmont to Cross Creek and Campbellton, and thus to the Atlantic and trade. German people traveling back and forth. All right. So, but obviously Gaelic as well. I'll put it right here. I have here a Gaelic Bible. Now, I've probably seen maybe 40 or 50 of these since I've been here. But think about this. Now, the fact that this has been rebound primitively with calfskin, that says something. You're not just going to throw it away because we're not. You're keeping this. It's important. All right. A lot of writing in it. A lot of writing in it. And it's saying that this man purchased this book in Fayetteville, his Gaelic Bible, in 1793. Then it's passed on to another person in later years who talks about this. This is my book now, and I am from Colonsay, and this is Scotland is my land and my dwelling place, and yada yada. A Gaelic Bible. But interestingly enough, not a single word written in it in Gaelic. Of all the Bibles I've seen, and I've seen a good number of them, I've never seen a Bible that had any Gaelic writing in it. So what does that tell us? Either it was a totem. You hold on to this. This means home. I'm supposed to do this. I'm supposed to get this. Maybe I can read it. Maybe I can't. I don't know. But this is the most numerous surviving item of Gaels in the Carolinas is the Gaelic Bibles. But again, that's important. Selling books. We have a printing press in Fayetteville. Printed Dougal Crawford's sermon, 1791. And in 1826, they printed a hymnody of Peter Grant, who was one of the first evangelical hymn writers in Scotland. Not the lined out psalms, metered psalms, but evangelical hymns. Amazing Grace, the sweet, sweet to sound. That sort of thing, Printed here. 1826. There's a demand. So it tells us something right there. Let's talk about another of the accounts here. We have a man that visited the region in 1860. Now, he's talking about the religious stuff. He says, worthy ministers, Sunday after Sunday, point them to the cross of Calvary in the language of their plaided and bonneted ancestors. And in these congregations may be seen many a swarthy African whose forefathers worshipped little wooden idols on the Congo River, listening to the words of eternal life spoken to them in a language now fast disappearing from among the mountains that give it birth. Many of these dusky sons of another clime speak Gaelic, as well as if they were natives of Lochaber. African Americans. All right. The Reverend David McCrae, Presbyterian minister from Dundee, traveled throughout North America, published a pretty popular travel journal after the Civil War. He notes again, he wrote 2 chapters about his visit in North Carolina, the Highland Settlement, and he says that Gaelic was once prominently spoken here, but now there's only a few that hold on to it with a romantic attachment, and those in isolated regions. So Civil War starting to decline. But let's talk about the reverse traveler. There was actually people that went from here back home to Scotland. These I find interesting as well, and I think you will too. Let's hear from one of them. There's a man named Neil McLaurin who's buried out here at Stewartsville Cemetery. I know Louisa Stewart's going to know exactly the stone I'm talking about out there. All right. Neil McLaurin was a merchant in Wilmington, and he traveled back to Appin in 1838. This is what he wrote in his diary. He said, "There was a crowd at Port Appin when I landed. I spoke in the Gaelic language, which, by the way, I speak better than any of them. For the English to them, shame it be said, is the language most commonly spoken in conversation among the natives, and they speak it well, though, of course, with the copious seasoning of the brogue." Now, he went on to say that those that he heard speaking Gaelic spoke it so poorly that if he heard his own children speaking it that poorly, that he'd punish them. 1838. 40 years after this man's family has immigrated. So 50 years after they've immigrated, pardon me. Yeah, so again, some interesting accounts there. And another one. This is from a court case in Fayetteville. Judge Carmichael is going to appreciate this, I hope. 2 attorneys contesting a case for a criminal in the court in Fayetteville. Mr. Leach, obviously Leach, that name we now know is a Hope County name, I know, and a Mr. Banks. I think Mr. Banks could possibly have been James Banks. I mean, it was sort of a romantic writer about Flora MacDonald and the Scots in the 1840s. Not sure about that, but nonetheless, Mr. Leach, well, here's what happened. The 2 attorneys find out that the jury are all Gaelic speakers. So one of them asked to address the jury in Gaelic. He's looking for a little one-upsmanship here. And so he speaks to them, and then the opposing attorney, well, judge may have the same same opportunity which he's given. And he said, first, Mr. Leach upbraided Mr. Banks for his bad Gaelic and declared if he had heard his own children speaking the ancient and noble language so ungrammatically, he would take the toss to him. Then they took up the case. He made a magnificent speech in Gaelic, carried the enthusiastic jury with him, and got a unanimous verdict for the prisoner. So here we go. Even used in the courts. It's very prominent around here. The African Americans. We've made some hints toward that. And this is one of the ones that I think is really one of the most fascinating facets of this legacy. All right? Annie Grant of Lagan. We read that quote, "I've seen Negroes born in such families who could not speak a word of English." All right? That's 1790s. All right? Here's a man that visits here, again, the Duncan Stewart, who talked about hearing and seeing African Americans listening to Gaelic in churches. All right? There's a slave named Glasgow. This is 1861, Fayetteville Observer. On Wednesday last, Glasgow, a Negro man belonging to Graham D. Baker, Esquire of this county, died at the age of 113. He said he had a son, 18 years of age, at the dark day in 1778 when he went to the house and found his master and mistress on their knees praying, supposed the end of the world had come. All the fowls had gone to roost, and etc. But he spoke the Gaelic language. He was remarkable for his truthfulness and sobriety. He'd been blind for 20 years, but possessed other faculties until 2 days before his death when attacked by sudden illness. A Gaelic-speaking slave. All right? Now, there's a whole lot more of that. This is, I think, the most fascinating account of an African American that's been found. This comes from a Canadian newspaper. And it's regarding some Isla people who worked on the steamboat lines and docks there at Campbellton. So there's a man called Tom. He's a Gaelic-speaking slave that worked with Angus Ray and other Isla men on the Cape Fear River. When he was told one day that he had to work with an all-slave crew, he feigned sickness until he could join a group of Isla men whose company he always preferred. He said Angus recalled that he danced and he sang in Gaelic and he sang the song. In fact, he's got it all written out there. There's a song called Salanila, singing the praises of Isla. And his verses translate as, "It was in Ballinaby that I was born and brought up. It was in Ballinaby that I always dwelt." It's a township on the west coast of Isla. It's home to a lot of the people from here in North Carolina that settled there. All right. They said he could speak Gaelic better than he could speak English. And when he heard the Highlanders speaking the Highlands, he mixed himself in and made himself like one of them, almost like he felt like he was from there as well. Here's a man singing, prefers to be with these people. He feels like one. He's adapted. He is assimilated into this unique culture. And then we know of the efforts of the Reverend Sinclair, who ministered to freed slaves following the Civil War, possibly having spoken to some of them in Gaelic as well. Tradition says there's a church called Love Grove, AME Zion near Sanford, that was founded by James Sinclair, that may have been served by Gaelic-speaking lay ministers as late as the time of the First World War. So it could be the last Gaelic church services preached in North Carolina were preached to African Americans. An interesting twist of fate. There's a man that says, a scholar now passed away, that said that there was more influence on the African American community from Scottish Gaels than there was from any others. A man called Willie Ruff. He was a jazz musician. He was a contemporary, knew and played with Dizzy Gillespie. So there's a Laurinburg connection there. But he says, I've been to Africa many times in search of my cultural identity, but it was in the Highlands that I found the cultural roots of Black America. We as Black Americans have lived under a misconception. Our cultural roots are more Afro-Gaelic than Afro-American. Just look at the Harlem phone book. It's more like the phone book of North Uist. We got our names from the slave masters. We got our religion from the slave masters. We got our blood from the slave masters. An interesting thought. Very controversial, but certainly there were influences there. All right. The decline. Civil War. The outmigration of Gaels, south and west, diluted this community, took Gaelic to Mississippi and Alabama and South Georgia in the 1830s and 40s, but diluted it here, perhaps. The last groups to really reinforce that Gaelic-speaking community, 1830s, 1840s. There's a group of people lived down near Little Rock, South Carolina, that came as late as 1838 from the island of Isla. You know, the Flat Branch Shaws, their people came from Isla around 1838, same time. You know, so again, relatively late, almost within living memory, but not quite. All right. And then in 1884, the coming of these few crofters from Scotland, a little newspaper blurb I found for the Carthage Gazette in Moore County says that it's great to hear the old Scots conversing with the new Scots in Gaelic on the street in Carthage, 1884. All right. So, what survivals do we have? Of those 1884 immigrants, there's several of them that were here locally. A man named Murdoch MacDonald that lived out in Antioch was a native of Lewis, would have been a Gaelic speaker. Several people remembered him. Gone. There's just a stone in Antioch Cemetery, Murdoch MacDonald, native of Stornoway, Lewis. Alexander Mackenzie, again, married into the Riverton families here, buried up at Spring Hill, another Lewis man. We know he was a Gaelic speaker, at least knew Gaelic. Died 1927, within living memory almost. The McRaes of McRae Meadow. We had a presentation that included some info on them. Part of that as well. Their sons, born in Scotland and born here, spoke Gaelic until the 1960s. In fact, people that drove through the crossroads in Linville in the 1960s talked about how they would talk among themselves in the corner of a little greasy spoon, talking about people in their own language, you know. It was a great professor at UNC, Urban T. Holmes, who was a great folklorist and linguist, He's sort of noted as the man that began teaching Japanese at the outbreak of World War II. He said, give me 2 weeks and I'll learn Japanese, and something to that nature, and he did and taught it. But he had an article that he wrote in Gaelic. I think he spoke about 30 different languages fluently. He wrote this article in Gaelic and said the last fluent speaker died in 1927 and was a member of the Longstreet congregation. But we know that there were people that were speakers that spoke later. But that's perhaps one of the ones that was still right there where they came from, settled right there in 1927. So think of that. My grandmother would have been 27 years old at that point. You know, a lot of you, same thing. Almost within living memory here. And then the legacy of the Flat Branch Shaws, Lachlan and Malcolm. A lot of people are going to recognize those names. Malcolm was the great storyteller. Lachlan was the great fiddle player who still knew some words and bits and pieces of Gaelic. And when I first did a program like this back in 1992, I got a hold of old Malcolm, and I had him come along with me to this presentation. And I said, now, folks, you want to hear some North Carolina Gaelic? And he got up and spoke. And he said what he thought was the 23rd Psalm. It was part of the 23rd Psalm. It was part of an evangelical hymn, and it was part of a charm for distilling whiskey. He didn't know what it was all saying, but I took that recording to a conference I spoke at the University of Glasgow in 1992, and I played it on that old cassette recorder. And I said, listen to this. And a couple of these scholars, great scholars, said, who is that man from Jura? I said, no. And I said, listen for a moment. He says, and you want to hear that again? Their eyes got this big. I said, who is that man? They said, that's a man that lives outside of Spring Lake, North Carolina right now, and he's probably one of the last men that knew any Gaelic. And their eyes just get, he said, he's speaking in a flawless Isle of Jura dialect. This is 1989 that I made a recording. That close. That close. So what's left? What's left? We see on our map, the second page here, the locations of some of those Gaelic-speaking congregations. But see, it's pretty, that isn't all of them. Those are the ones that I could sort of document and place around. There's over 30 of them there. All right? Those remembrances. We go back into church history. Say, you know, Gaelic was once spoken here. You know, you find it in all the old church history. It doesn't say when they stopped it, unfortunately, but they just say the ministers did. So we know it was a big part of their history. It's noted. The documents, the charm, circa 1750, one of the few documents. This one copy, this one now, unfortunately, scanned copy. Hopefully somebody at the First Presbyterian Church of Fayetteville will be able to look through their drawers and safes and file cabinets and find this. They've gotten tired of me up there. The minister didn't want to see me coming. I have been at him so many times about this because it's so important, but hopefully someday. The poems of Ian McVertice, written here in Moore County, were transmitted through oral tradition. They're collected in Cape Breton in Australia, back in Scotland. That tells a story of a Gaelic-speaking loyalist here in the Revolutionary War, transferred worldwide through the oral tradition. There's a poem in Gaelic written, you'll see it on the display in my display room there, written in Gaelic by a Confederate soldier from South Georgia whose family came out of Robeson County down that way in the 1820s. He was disabled during the war, goes back home, evidently in a case of unrequited love, and he writes this poem about how this old man has taken his beloved away from him, charmed her away from him, and written in Gaelic. It's something that I found, never been found before. I found it a number of years ago at the Wilson Library at Chapel Hill. Had it translated. We did a program on it, a paper that was delivered at the International Celtic Congress with Dr. Katrina Parsons a number of years ago. That's one of the few things. The Bibles. No writing in Gaelic, but Bibles. A few folks remember some words. When I was first here in the 80s, I remember a couple of old people. One man in particular, I wish I knew who he was, came up to me and says, yeah, my granny used to hold me on her lap and rock me and sing songs in Gaelic to me. And I only wish I knew who that was. It had been 1985. Gone now. The place names. Bowmore. here between here and Rayford. And I hate that state has not put up the sign Bowmore because I loved it. And if anybody knows where it is, I'll put it up someplace around here if you find it because I'd love to have it. But they didn't replace it when they widened 401. Pure Gaelic name, Bowmore in Iowa. Dewart, Tobermory, Dundalk. How many people know where Dundalk is? A lot of y'all gonna know where Dundalk is.
Dundalk where the McLaurin.
In Athens? Okay. Well, the interesting story about Dundalk, I heard somebody once told me, he asked somebody locally, do you know why it's called that? Do you know what Dundalk is? Because the translation is the hill of the oak tree. Now, anybody's been to Dundalk, there ain't many hills around there at all. There's oak trees maybe, but more pines than oaks, but not very many hills. I said, well, the story was that when General Sherman's men were marching through, that they decided to stop there and camp because it was done dark. Done dark, as opposed to Dundalk in the Gaelic. So we have place names. We have plantation names given. Here in Scotland County, we had Ballachulish. Leaving town of Bennettsville, plantation was called Appin. All these people recognized places that they came from. These Gaelic place names, still known. But I think perhaps interestingly and in maybe an entertaining way to close out this presentation, turn to your last page. This is something I came up with just a couple mornings ago. I said, how can we employ all these little words into something? So I'm going to read this out loud. You can read along. But for the benefit of those watching, this little thing I came up with called A Morning in the Life of a Carolina Gael, with a little Gaelic included. All right. You're going to see in bold print the words that are Gaelic influenced or pure Gaelic. Our Scottish Gaels wake from a long night's rest. The farmer puts on his breeches and his brogan shoes, and he heads out for his daily chores while his wife fixes his breakfast, making sure to include a smidgen of sugar on top, just like he likes it. He heads out to check his cattle, making sure not to trip over the stobs sticking out of the ground in his yard. He calls up his cattle, just like his father and grandfather did. Sook, sook, sook. How many people ever heard that? I just found that out not too long ago. That's a Gaelic way of calling cows. My dad did that. I imitated that when I was 7 years old. I had no clue it had any Gaelic ties whatsoever. Sook, sook, sook. They slowly approach the familiar sounds. He approaches one of those mole-headed cattle and gives her a pat. After their morning hay and water, he leads the heifers to the stall where his wife is waiting to take the morning milk. She sits down on her stool and she begins soothing the cow before her milking. Saw, 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 she gently murmurs as she begins tugging on the udders, perhaps singing a rhyme or a song in rhythm, just like our ancestors did. After finishing, she takes the milk down to the spring house to keep it cool in the day's heat. She certainly doesn't want it to clabber up. The farmer goes to check on his chickens and collect the eggs, which he gently places in a poke and stands back admiring all the little biddies he sees. He's got chickens galore, a whole slew of them. He'll look forward to a good fried chicken dinner for a special Sunday where there's that extra piece of chicken cut up just the Scottish traditional way, like Johnson and Boswell were served by Flora MacDonald before she left Skye, and just like his ancestors did not so very long ago. Those of you from around here, I grew up in the Piedmont. You cut chicken different down here. You cut chicken with that little, it's my favorite piece of chicken, the little white piece. Yeah, well, yeah, and the Scottish way. All right. Different way. That's where it comes from. That's why we have it down here and not where I came from originally. All right. As he exits the chicken house door and bars the door, now that's a Scots term, but some of you might know that old song, "Get Up and Bar the Door." It fit in. But not before that old warped door bounces back and hits his poke of eggs. And he looks down and he sees that stain growing, and he's broken one of the eggs. Shoot, he exclaims as he goes on to continue the rest of his day. All Gaelic. And that's some of what survives here in Carolina. In our southern speak, and a lot of us have that blood coursing through our veins. Topalet, thank you very much for coming out tonight. Do I have any questions? Any questions I might be able to address? What happened to people speaking Gaelic? All right. There are patterns for that. There's some prominent folklorists that have said, all right, let's give a 3-generation period following immigration. Your first generation that arrives, they hold tight to what they know. They hold tight to tradition. That second generation, they want to break away. And that third generation, they want to go back and try to recapture what they've got. Now, that speaks to tradition. Now, as far as language goes, take the parallel of what we see now in North Carolina. Red Springs, North Carolina. How many of you are going to go into a convenience store and hear Spanish spoken? All the time. All the time. You know, if you go back and say maybe those might have been Gaelic speakers in the 1850s. Think of it that way. Think of it that way. We have bilingual church services, Hispanic services, Korean services, you know. In fact, when I took a descendant of one of these Gaelic ministers back to Galatia, where her third great uncle preached, and there was a sign, you know, Hispanic service at such and such a time in front of this church, and I thought, wow, isn't this sort of serendipitous that here's a church that once had bilingual church services and now still having them in another language. So two generations, 2.5 generations, if there's not reinforcement, and you got to have that community to speak it. You know, I'm speaking to those of you from Red Springs. I know there's a lot of Spanish speakers around Red Springs. Those people, they're reinforced. Are their children maybe ESL students in the schools? But they're learning it. So are their kids going to be bilingual probably? You know, so you got 2.5 generations, maybe something like that. That sort of starts to give us, you know, but the lack of reinforcement, as well as the fact that even though it's the language of home and hearth, it's not the language of commerce and the interaction with everyone you need to interact with. So a few things that sort of may explain that a little bit, as well as the fact, just like the way in Scotland, there's a lot of young people growing up in the Highlands and the Gael talk, you know, look, oh, I don't want to do that. That's old. That's like Granny did, you know. Opinions and thoughts about that have changed a bit, you know. And, oh, yeah, I want to know that. I want to learn that. So there's a lot of flux there, and it sort of depends on community attitudes as well as how it's served. You know, Spanish speakers, if they didn't have Spanish-speaking church services, they'd either meet among themselves or learn enough English to go to church. Sort of what happened with the Gaelic speakers, maybe something like that. I don't know. Just a lot of what ifs. We don't know, but you can really think. But my analogy on that one is, think about it when you go in a convenience store and you hear a Spanish speaker. 1850, that could have just as well been a Gaelic speaker. Other questions?
How about like Hampton, Sydney, and Davidson? Would they have taught any classes?
We don't have any knowledge. I have no indications whatsoever of anyone actually teaching Gaelic here.
No, teaching in Gaelic. Not, instead of lecturing in English, would they have lectured in Gaelic?
No. But interestingly enough, that's where Colin McKeever went to school. And he came from Lewis, went to school there, would have been a Gaelic speaker, but probably never had anyone else to use it with. But I don't have any, Blake, you know, ever heard of it? I've never seen any account of anyone teaching Gaelic. You know, teaching, you know, we had these people that are, you know, ministers or the schoolmasters that are teaching, setting up schools to educate people, but it's Latin, you know, and English, you know. You're going to move up the ladder, you got to speak English. Just the way the taxman class that led these people in could have spoken Gaelic with the neighbors, but English is the language of advancement.
Yeah, just interesting that they're Presbyterian Presbyterian rooted
Institutions. Yeah.
institutions. And you would have thought many of the early professors probably would have been educated in Scotland.
Well, yeah, and certainly, I mean, all of these ministers I spoke of, all these Presbyterian ministers, those are Edinburgh, Glasgow. Those are top-notch people, except for those first 5 that were then here in 1801 that were educated at the Law College, that went on to Alabama and to Memphis, Tennessee, and to Central Tennessee, and all these other places. But just no, not on the. And the interesting thing, not a single thing in Scots Gaelic in higher education in the United States. And some of you will know that a few years ago, a number of us tried to get together a fundraiser. We're ready to start a campaign. Mary Ann was involved, leaning back on that. We were prepared. $3.5 million. We can make this happen. And unfortunately, UNC turned it down. Didn't want it. Of course, the liberal arts, new liberal arts things, lost the niche. But this is the place it should have been if it was going to happen. You can do it in Canada, do it in Scotland. We have American students who go to Scotland to do it. My good friend Jamie McDonald might be watching. He did it. It was a pioneer. Come back, but there's not the demand here. Unfortunately, very unfortunately. Yeah, Blake.
I worked with Willie Ruff on his documentary.
Did you really? Uh-huh.
We filmed actually out at Mill Pond and
Uh-huh.
Long Street.
Uh-huh.
He was an interesting.
Yeah, and he says that he used to tell that Dizzy Gillespie's grandparents knew Gaelic. That'd been from Terrell, Chesterfield, down that way. Certainly plausible. Certainly plausible. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming out tonight, January 23rd. John Charles McNeil, Robert Burns the South. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thank all of you online for being there with us. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.
I sent it to you outside of Balquitter.
Oh, uh-huh.
It's done there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I didn't know there was one there.
Yeah, just outside of Balquitter.
Okay.
Past that sign, I thought, damn, stop, take a picture of that. So you got it.
If anybody would like to take a look at any of the things I have up here, you're welcome to.